The results are in, and Armenian voters have spoken. Today is June 8, a day after Armenian voters went to the polls in parliamentary elections and highly contested parliamentary elections. Joining me to discuss the results election day and what we can expect in the coming weeks, months, and years are political scientists Dr. Nerses Kopalyan and Dr. Rafayel Oganesyan. Welcome to EVN Report again. Yeah. Well, we also conducted a poll together, yes, which we will talk about. But I want to start with you, Nerses, just to give us, and at this point everybody knows what the results are. But for many people it was quite surprising, and for others not so much. Tell me what your take is on the final results.
So there's both sides to the surprise element. The opposition, obviously, or those support the opposition, are surprised because they actually had high hopes of, if not winning, perhaps forming a coalition to do what was known as sort of the Gyumri situation, right? Where you have about 3 up to 4 opposition parties winning sufficient votes to limit the plurality of civil contract and therefore forming a coalition. That did not pan out. So in that context, a civil contract still secured a majority, which to the opposition was unexpected in the sense that they thought their performance, their ability, this was their opportunity to basically make this happen. From supporters of civil contract, from their perspective, they were relatively surprised based on data we're seeing that they did not win a majority easily, that it came down to the last vote, that even when there were conversations of a possible 2/3 constitutional majority, it was nowhere close to that. So both sides had expectations, right? And so in our political culture in Armenia, right, surprise is based off of your expectations not being met, as opposed to like empirically looking at how things went. But when we look at it in comparative terms, we did see an overperformance by the opposition parties. Okay, so we're going to, for the sake of analysis, we're going to basically combine 3 of the opposition parties together: Strong Armenia, Armenia Alliance, and Prosperous Armenia, because they've already said ahead of time they're going to form a coalition against civil contract.
But was that even realistic? Do you guys think that they would have actually come together had they had the votes?
Well, whether they had the vote or not, that's besides the point. No, but we still was the fact that all 3 got into parliament, nothing got wasted. So therefore, we could speak of them as a single bloc that's going to enter parliament in a coalition. So when we look at the numbers of the, so let's say the anti-Pashinyan vote, or we want to call it the pro-Russia vote, or we want to call it their numbers, between their numbers in 2021 and their numbers in this elections, we're seeing basically from a 5 to 8, 9% improvement.
For the opposition.
For the opposition bloc. While for civil contract, we saw a consistent 3 to 8% underperformance. Rafayel, I'm sure, is going to talk about this. We in political science, we call it the cost of ruling, which kind of explains a lot of this diminishing returns. But overall, it was very interesting in the sense that in some areas like Yerevan, civil contract actually overperformed 2021. And Yerevan's supposed to be, right. Mm-hmm. While in places like Aragatzoten, or places like Armavid, or places like Tavush, which are like strongholds for civic contract, they underperformed by 6%, 8%, even 10%, which is very, very interesting, right? While the opposition bloc, collectively, the 3 parties were overperforming at 7%, 8%. It was very, very interesting. One region that really stood out was Lodi. In 2021, right, civil contract got almost 60% in Lodi. This time, they got 49%. While the opposition bloc collectively had 26% in 2021, this time they got close to 40%.
And why do you think that is?
We haven't done the post-mortem to understand why that is the case, but it could be a combination of factors like cost of ruling, high voter turnout, and of course, right, with Dashid, the city town, Dashid being in Lodi, that might have been a factor. But it isn't specific to Lodi. We're seeing a consistent trend in the shifts. So civil contract did well collectively in being able to secure 50%, right, after so many years of ruling. So in that context, in a parliamentary system, it still stands out.
Right. This is their third term, and they got 49.81%. So, I mean, just shy of 5%, 50%.
We're rounding things up, but absolutely, yeah.
Yerevan is interesting to me. I mean, because we were all expecting that civil contract, like in the past, would underperform compared to 20.
Right. So in 2021, they underperformed compared to 2018.
Right.
But this year, they slightly overperformed, okay, by about 1%, maybe a 0.5% margin. So the losses, the underperformance that we saw in other regions, we didn't see it in Yerevan. That being said, the opposition collectively in 21 had about 36%, all the three groups. This time they had 39%. So they slightly improved, but them dominating. So civil contract still won Yerevan, which is very, very interesting in that context.
Right. Rafayel, yesterday you were an observer in Norkmarash, one of the suburbs of Yerevan, and you had a wild experience, I think, which we could talk about a bit later. But I do want to talk about our polling and the results themselves, because we did 4 waves of our poll, and the last one we presented on June 4, the 4th wave, and you had included an additive index model where you would project what the large block of undecided voters, how they would tilt. But we saw that Strong Armenia really overperformed, did it not? Why do you think that is? Talk a little bit about the poll and about Strong Armenia.
So starting with the additive index, right? People, individuals that we categorized as most and more likely put civic contract or civil contract at a majority. And then if we included the somewhat, they put it, I believe, just short of a majority. Vice versa. They were at 45 with most and more likely, and I believe with 54 with somewhat most and more likely.
Right. So the range was between 45 to 55%.
Correct. And so if we look at 49, it's approximately right in the middle.
Right.
So in that sense, we can say that we were quite close. And so the voters that voted for them ended up being those middle voters, right? The somewhat voters. Some tilted and some didn't. That's why they're right dead in the middle. Strong Armenia performed better than expected. Anecdotally speaking, again, I'll say just bluntly, it appeared as I was. So when we first started this survey, for the most part, I was outside. But then I came to Armenia the last 3 weeks. I attended all of the 4-party rallies, met with them, walked with them. And the sense I got, especially some from the opposition, the individuals that were supportive, was that they were unwilling to talk politics openly unless they figured out you were one of them.
Of the opposition camp?
The opposition camp, correct. And so
we were sensing a certain social desirability bias.
Right, which is what we talked about. Right.
Yeah. Did you sense the same thing with Strong Armenia or only Armenia Alliance?
Strong Armenia. Armenia Alliance, I would say they did not have a good showing in terms of their rally. They lost a lot of their support to Strong Armenia. But the Strong Armenia individuals that once you realized you were with them shared a lot of that this is a tyrannical regime, this is a Western regime, and this is a regime that's going to basically bring about repopulation of Azeris into this. This was a constant message, not only by the elite, but also as you walk with these voters, you talk with them.
So that whole narrative that Strong Armenia was pushing about the 300,000 Azerbaijanis, it really resonated clearly then.
I would say it resonated more with the younger crowd than I would say with the older crowd. By younger, I'm talking about middle age to young people. But it definitely resonated because they were constantly being primed this information. Now, we can talk about the realities of this, but for that campaign, the Strong Armenia campaign, consistently rely on that message. Now, that message ended up coming, I would say, toward the end cycle of the election, maybe the 8th and 9th inning, but it was a message that was constantly promoted among their rallies as well as among their candidates. And it was basically 1 to 2 messages, right? A second-tier message was the economic jobs, the opportunities, the tourism that administration would create. But the number one most salient topic that they were priming to their voters was the 300,000. Nothing but 300,000. Even during their main speech in Yerevan, right? They stood there with that little flyer of the supposed policy that they're going to be discussing in Nakhichevan in the coming days, and then they all ripped it in very symbolically. So this was something that really resonated with their voters because they was constantly being primed. More importantly, this was something that was mentioned during the vote count last night by precinct level commission members that are supposed to be staying nonpartisan.
Right, we'll get to that because I do want to talk about that experience. But I also want to briefly touch upon Armenia Alliance. So they certainly lost a lot of votes. They bled to Strong Armenia. And yet in our polling, they weren't even passing the threshold. So technically, based on our polling, they also overperformed because they got almost 10% of the vote.
One point I'll make is that in our polling, we did the additive index model only for civil contract because we were trying to understand the probability of majority single government.
Right, it wasn't applied to the other
Right,
parties.
it wasn't applied because we empirically we knew they could not ascertain enough votes for to form government. So that was one of the reasons. Also, if you want to do polling that also does additive index modeling for every party, we'll be polling until next year, right? So we have to be parsimonious. But our polling did demonstrate that approximately 47% of undecided voters will not be voting for civil contract. And so, in that sense, we knew obviously that from those undecideds who would not be voting for civil contract will be tilting to either of the three parties. What we saw is that they mostly exclusively tilted towards Strong Armenia and Armenia Alliance. They did not tilt towards Prosperous Armenia because Prosperous Armenia's numbers of 4% this time was precisely similar to last time, except last time they got 3.95, and so they just missed it. Our model accounted for Strong Armenia at 12%, not addressing undecideds, and Armenian Alliance at 4%, not addressing undecideds. So, of course, with that undecideds, the numbers are very, very different. But now that we saw, per our model, how the undecideds that were anti-Pashinyan tilted, we got the numbers that we got.
Before we talk about Election Day, the Strong Armenia phenomenon to me is fascinating because here's a party that came out of nowhere, right? First time running. Its leader, multiple citizenships, can't even take part, can't even become a member of parliament. Explain to me, if you will, how it is that they are able to come out of nowhere and secure, 23% of the vote, where Armenia Alliance, Prosperous Armenia, and these, we also had third way parties. We also had pro-democracy parties, pro-West parties, and they performed miserably. How do you explain this?
Well,
is it the fear factor? No, I mean, did it really work?
I think...
I look at the numbers, but Raf, what is your assessment?
So right off the bat, the main difference between Strong Armenian and Armenia Alliance in 21 is Armenia Alliance has skeletons in their closet, right? That is an alliance.
Strong Armenia didn't exist in 21.
Strong Armenia's candidate never ran for any type of an election,
Right.
public office. And so it's in the U.S., right, we're talking about individuals, candidates that have skeletons in their closet. That is, they've been in the public sphere too many times and build up a lot of bad reputation. And you had candidates that are coming in fresh off, being very junior level politicians with lack of skeletons in their closet tend to do better. And so we're in 21, when Strong Armenia ran Kocharyan, there were skeletons in the closet, right? People are very divisive on Kocharyan.
Right,
As we saw
as
in
our
our poll,
polls
the
showed,
majority
yeah,
did not
yeah.
like him. Say what you say about Samuel Karapetyan, how he earned his money in Russia. He's not a public official. No one can say he was responsible for the mismanagement of the Republic of Armenia, our electoral system, or human rights violations.
Trauma, right.
And so people saw him as being a prospective leader. There's no retrospective analysis of him being in public life.
But it just goes to show how the electorate is searching for someone to hold on to.
Are they, though?
Aren't they?
Are they? When I looked at the numbers, it's very interesting. So in 2021, Armenia Alliance got 21%. This time, Strong Armenia got 23%. So the shift isn't that much, right? There's about a 2% difference between the leading
Right.
anti-Pashinyan, anti-Velvet, pro-Russia opposition party from 21 to 23. So we only saw a 2% improvement on that. And obviously, Strong Armenia took a lot of the votes from Armenia Alliance. But when we look at sort of structurally, right, the two top parties only performed 2% better this time. What was interesting, though, with the high voter turnout, their numbers were much larger. Now, I think Armenia Alliance, while having lost all their votes to Strong Armenia, performed relatively better this time as the second anti-Pashinyan party compared to the Balti-Bunem alliance in 2021. That got about
That was Sarkisyan's,
right,
I
that
have
got about
honor.
5.5%. So when you look at structurally, right, first place, second place, third place, the first place opposition parties are fairly close, 21, 23. Second place, it was about like 5 and 9.5. This is where you see the improvement. But then with Prosperous Armenia, 395, 4, exactly the same. So is this discrepancy? In that context, the opposition bloc based on 2021 had about a 6.5% improvement this time. So it wasn't as if it was a very large shift. But what is very interesting is that, as Rafayel noted, Strong Armenia came and basically gave a new brand to the anti-Pashinyan voter bloc. Also, as Rafayel noted in his engagement with opposition members, party members, activists, so on and so forth, in a lot of my conversations with similar people, they viewed Kopalyan as a loser, politically a loser, in the sense that he lost in 2021, so they needed someone who they thought had a higher probability of winning, and so Kopalyan became a preferable alternative. They also ran a campaign that was much better at mobilizing.
Yeah, they spent lots of money.
And whereas in 21, Kopalyan really refused to campaign and hit the streets, Strong Armenia campaigned quite well. They were very active, very much like civil contract. Maybe not at that level, but in Armenia we have not seen an opposition party doing this, and that's reflected in the voter outcome.
Right. I do want to talk about, before I lay this to rest in my own head, why the other parties performed so poorly. We had, for example, Haik Marutyan, former mayor of Yerevan, very well known, individual, Arman Tatoyan, a former human rights ombudsman. They were trying to run pretty good campaigns. I'm not going to talk about the others because some of them were just, I don't even know who they are. Why did they not perform? I mean, because what we're seeing right now is if you're a Pashinyan supporter, you're a hardcore supporter. If you hate him, you really hate him, right? So we see this huge division. And in the middle now we have these Strong Armenia. But what about the pro-West, pro-democracy forces? Why did they perform so dismally, in your opinion?
I mean, I'll just go to give you a parsimonious answer. I think a lot of the voters just do a referendum on Pashinyan. I mean, the way
was this a referendum on
the
Pashinyan?
way people vote, I will say the way
It's always a referendum.
the way people vote all over the world. There's a thing called incumbent-centric hypothesis. That is, when they enter the voting booth, they simply do a referendum on the incumbent, and that is the reason, because the information cost is much lower for the incumbent than it is for the opposition. For example, with the incumbent, you already know the policies you have, so it's easily recallable. Am I doing better or worse? But for the opposition, you have to think, okay, based on this implementation of this hypothetical policy, how will my life be? Now, according
Do you think
to
that complex thought was going through people's minds?
No. So according to Anthony Downs in Economic Theory of Democracy, he basically says that the latter is very, very minimal, and it's only present in individuals that are highly partisan or very sophisticated. That most individuals simply go look at the
So we call
incumbent.
heuristics, mental
Correct.
shortcuts. They
Yep.
use mental shortcuts to vote. So most voters are unsophisticated, therefore they vote the way they vote.
And so I think what happens is the fact that this becomes a referendum on Pashinyan, it takes the oxygen out of a room for a new way of understanding Armenian politics. So because if you're for Pashinyan, you're not going to vote for Haik Marutyan because Pashinyan's on the ballot. If you're anti-Pashinyan, you sort of know at this point by now that you don't want to waste your vote on these small parties that are not going to be considered, because we are a parliamentary system, and so you immediately are going to run to one of the 2 or 3 main opposition parties. And this is why, real quick, this is why if you noticed in the Yerevan rallies, most of the parties that were present that made these huge rallies were either Strong Armenia from the opposition, Strong Armenia, Armenia Alliance, and Prosperous Armenia. The other ones almost had no showing in Yerevan major rallies.
Yeah, right.
So what I saw very interestingly in observing the data is that the Strong Armenia and Armenia Alliance approach to this whole the voter approach was one of strategic voting. very similar to what we saw with civil contract in 21. So a lot of the strong Armenia or Armenia Alliance voters, even a lot of the anti-Pashinyan voters that may not in the past have voted for example, Kopalyan, voted strategically that they did not want to waste their vote. So they had the anti-Pashinyan vote, and that's how it went. But to your question about the other parties not making the thing, parliamentary threshold. So, for example, like Armand Tato and Wings of Unity spent a lot of money. And they tried to establish a national game because they had presence in various parts. He only performed well in Sunik because of his legacy being human rights advancement and so on and so forth, but he underperformed everywhere else, right? So he was, so regardless of all the money he spent, he was not able to develop a grassroots organic process. Haik Marutian had the inverse problem. He's only known in Yerevan. Outside of Yerevan, he did not have a national infrastructure.
Right.
And that matters because a strong Armenia had a presence everywhere. Civil contract has presence everywhere. Armenia Alliance, being in government, in parliamentary opposition of 5 years, has a presence, right? So in that sense, the ability or the capacity to intensely campaign at the various levels of the regions was missing. But when you look at the results in Yerevan, right, we see all of the opposition parties, pro-democracy parties, whatever you want to call them, the middleweight parties, they performed relatively speaking, decently in Yerevan, but had almost no performance, with the exception of Armand Tatyon's and Sunik, throughout Armenia. So we saw a lot of like 1.5% in Yerevan, 2%, 2.5%, even 3% in Yerevan, but
nothing in the
they ended up
regions,
getting 0.8 or 1, right? So the issue with all pro-West, pro-democracy, middleweight, third option, all these parties, that they're so concentrated in Yerevan, they don't have a ground game, an infrastructure throughout the nation. So their electoral capacity seems more attuned to like Yerevan's municipal elections as opposed to a national electoral structure.
How do you explain the high voter turnout? It was really high for Armenia, right? Almost at 60%.
It was unexpectedly high and a positive sign of democratic
Although in
growth.
our poll, when we asked people if they would be voting, and 90% said that they would, and we factored in that 30 to 40%
Yeah, the
wouldn't
turnout
actually.
gap, 20 to 30%. So it was
Yeah.
about 60, consistent with the modeling.
So we've often heard if there's a higher voter turnout, it means that people are ready to go vote against probably the incumbent. Is this a fair statement?
Yeah, I would say yeah, and that's what we were predicting a little bit. We'll say higher numbers for a civil contract, but that's based on a low voter turnout. And we even talked about anecdotally that a higher voter turnout favors the opposition. And interestingly enough, this is something that locals also understood. Yesterday, among several observers, they also understood that low voter turnout favors the incumbent and a higher voter turnout favors the opposition. One reason for the higher voter turnout, and I guess I can talk about this just an overall assessment of the 2026 election, is that all of these parties, including the so-called pro-Russia parties, took their message out to the people, right? Not a lot of busing was done for the rallies in Yerevan. And so they basically went door to door, right? We even saw flyers being handed out by United Armenia door to door. And so if you take your message to the people, right, get out the vote effort or Go TV, maybe this is a new phenomenon for the Armenian voters.
But it's also very
Retail
positive.
politics, right? Retail politics.
But this is a very good thing for
It is.
Armenian
It's a great
democracy.
thing. No, it's a great
yes,
thing,
yeah.
and this can be one of the factors that led to the higher voter turnout, because one would imagine Armenian voters is generationally not used to people knocking on their door, giving them flyers, or just simply having rallies to get more and more people involved in the process.
Yeah, so we saw strong Armenia emulate a lot of the campaigning models of civil contract, and correctly so, because civil contract had sort of a not on purpose, but a monopoly on retail politics, because they were activists. They were the ones that were actually
street politicians, yeah.
door to door, neighborhoods, buildings, right, yards, and all that stuff. And this is not something that traditional authoritarian vestige parties did. And so Strong Armenia, right, to an extent, to their credit, they came and they said, well, we're going to start the love bus, but, do it a little differently. And we're going to go door to door, and we're going to visit villages and see people and all that rest of Kopalyan did not run a campaign like this in 21, right? He was a lot more arrogant and distanced, but Strong Armenia made a concerted effort to at least engage in the practice of democratic politics, and this produces voter turnout, right? There's an old saying, the more hands you shake, the more votes you're going to get.
Right, absolutely.
We kind of saw that happening.
And another very positive thing, before we start talking about the maybe not so positive things, is that this is the third free and fair election.
Absolutely.
There were, of course, some violations, some irregularities. This is to be expected, but we no longer see a systemic violations on election day or prior to election day. So this also is a very, very positive trajectory for the country. I've been covering elections for way too many years, and it was the next day protests on the street. So far, it's relatively quiet, but we can talk a little bit more about that. So this is also another very positive building block in Armenia's very slow consolidation toward democracy. Yeah.
Yeah, 100% agree. I will also note, maybe we can talk about this towards the end, is the opposition has a recipe for an electoral victory in 5 years. Because of the cost of ruling right now, expect them to go way below majority, assuming they run a similar platform. And the opposition, as long as they maintain a democratic structure of taking their message out to the voters, changing some of the narratives, very last minute stuff that do not resonate, specifically with the 300,000 Azeris relocating. The reason for that is I invite people to look at negative voting. Negative voting tends to have a significant impact early on in the campaign when people have not made up their minds. And so negative campaigning and priming negative messages to undecided voters as the campaign nears gives you minimal benefit. And so I would encourage them to, seek out a different route, more policy-based route on Pashinyan. And I think they have a recipe for success in 5 years.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, somebody had written today on Facebook, I know we shouldn't quote Facebook, but it's where we see sometimes the pulse of the people. And someone was saying that I really hope that the opposition forces, don't talk about everything else that happened, but as you move forward, who are the MPs? Prepare them, talk about policy, build the country, and not only create this toxic environment of pointing fingers, which is what we often tend to do.
In our poll, we had a question on, do you think the elections will be free and fair? And 57% said yes. So that means there was a big chunk of non-Pashinyan voters who had trust in the electoral process.
This is excellent. Yeah,
and this is this is a very, very important point in that citizens are understanding you can affect change by voting, and that obviously is conducive to a developing political culture.
Absolutely. Okay, I do want to talk about very quickly election day, Rafayel, because you were, as I said, an observer. When I went to vote, there were a lot of elderly people who were struggling because the process is just archaic, right? So you had 19 or 18 ballots, and they one by one, they have to collect the ballots, give it to you, and then they had to explain. Sometimes they had to go with this elderly person, and then it was like, oh, there's two people behind the ballot box. Talk to me about how the electorate was, how the voters were, how the commissions were working. Because I think this is also very important for us to understand.
Yeah.
If we don't fix how we vote, this is going to be problematic.
So this was my third time being an observer, right? I was an observer in 2018, an observer in 21, and also an observer in 2026. So what I'm about to say is basically my own subjective opinion based on being located in a large district in Yerevan. So I'll start with the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the good. No major violations. Now, I know people, some of us who watch this video and their opposition poem, like, well, what are you talking about? All these violations. And so even yesterday, I got dozens of videos from relatives showing violations, right, into my Facebook feed. And the good news is almost every single one of those violations I was seeing as throughout the day. So when I'm talking about major violations, I'm talking about ballot stuffing, I'm talking about carousel voting, I'm talking about crowding. I'm talking about crowding in front of the electoral precinct, which they existed in the past. I'm talking about lights going out at 8 p.m., which supposedly happened a little bit in some of them. More importantly, I'm talking about violations that are not triggered from voters. That's key. Violations that are not triggered from voters during the process. And these violations are either from party proxies that are there or from members of the election commission that are overseeing the election. That is, they basically help somebody vote. Oh, here, let me put this in for you. We did not see that. Compared to 2018 and 2021, the process went more smooth. Again, relatively speaking. It went more smooth
I
than
was
the
in
other
and out in
times.
5 minutes, so I was happy.
Most of the violations are voter-induced violations. Let me
Meaning?
go through them real quick. Voting in front of the poll or at the submission desk.
What do you mean?
So, in Armenia, we
okay.
have the little box
Right.
and paper. And so the elderly would come and imagine the box is like this. They vote outside of the box in front of everybody. They're putting their little thing right in front of everybody, or they're putting it as they're submitting it.
But this
So
is
they're not
not
voting in
egregious.
secret.
This is not.
No.
Yeah, it was just because the process
That's
is
why I think
ridiculous.
he made the distinction
Yeah.
between a state
And voter-induced. Yeah.
It's still a violation. It's still something we have to record. Using a pen to vote. Oh, Jesus. For any Armenian out there, please do not use a pen to vote because that automatically makes your vote, what? Invalid. And so...
But there were no pens.
There were no
there.
pens. And so we were shocked that some people were like, "Es gricha umnem nishum." And they're like, "How'd you get the pen into this area?" "Oh, I brought it with me." No, don't use the pen. And so at the count in the precinct I was in, at least 5 or 6 ballots had a check mark and they're immediately invalidated. Being public about their vote. For some reason, they wanted it public. And another thing with the Armenian public is, so they have these 18 papers and they put one. For some reason, they thought that some of us may use those papers. They would take the other ones and just rip them up into tiny shreds and put them behind the box. And it takes so much time. And
Creates lineups.
Creates lineups.
Yeah.
So we're telling people, stop ripping these. They're going to go to the trash. Like they were somehow they were thinking we might try to put another number there. Voters having symbols, and this is something I want to talk about. Voters cannot have symbols in the polls. There was a lady that showed up. She had a little magnet of the Armenia.
Excuse me, the
map.
Prime Minister walked into the.
We'll talk
voting.
about that.
Okay.
That was a violation that
Of
should have
course
been
it
recorded,
was,
and he should have been sanctioned for that. But that's I'll talk
separate
about that.
issue,
The
sure.
ugly. But what happened is, so I'll give you a specific example on this. The lady walked in. And she had the map of the Armenia, which the Prime Minister's party gives. And she was, doing this, we immediately noticed. But again, we're observers. We cannot make that judgment call. So as she was voting, we immediately got on the phone with our attorneys, electoral attorneys. We said, hey, this is happening. They immediately told us, take a video. It is wrong. They cannot do this. They need to be pushed out. By the time we got that information, the voter had left.
Right.
So then we told the attorney, hey, the voter left. The attorney said, okay, go to the chairperson, tell them that they cannot accept people with any type of symbol.
Didn't the chair know this?
Chair did not see this. Again,
okay.
imagine
It's chaos.
It's
Right,
chaos.
right,
It's
right,
chaos.
right.
The chair is doing something else. A soldier shows up that does not have a passport, that now needs to go to the police to get a special permit to vote. And so there's chaos happening. And so at that moment, I went to the president, the chair, and I said, hey, this is what happened. She immediately stopped the entire process. She stopped. She told people, stop voting. She told everybody in that room, listen, if anybody shows up with any type of symbol, they have to be asked to leave or take out that symbol.
She should have done that in the morning.
That's another
But that's
violation.
But imagine where we've gone from the type of violations we used to talk
I know.
about.
Correct. No, I know. But still.
But this is a healthy indication
Yeah.
of an evolving political culture, right? We're actually saying, these are the rules. I mean, most average citizens would be like, they were wearing a pin, so what, right?
Yeah.
But because those rules were put in place for a certain reason. But now we've developed to such an extent where we view these things as trivial. But then that's also a very good indicator of how there's a systemic approach to understanding and addressing these problems.
And so I asked independent observers, specifically from Transparency International, I also asked the chairpersons there throughout the different precincts. From an American perspective, it appears you guys are being very nitpicky of these violations. I said, look, in the U.S. we have a thing called freedom of speech. I can walk with a Trump t-shirt and I can vote. I can walk with a Harris t-shirt, I can vote.
You could walk into precinct. Yeah.
Of course.
Things here are
But here
yeah,
they said,
crazy.
listen,
Yeah,
they said, given the history of the
Yes.
abuses,
Yeah.
we're extra careful about the small things. So for example, when somebody made a noise behind the ballot, all the observers rushed to that individual. Hey, what's going on? What's going on? Right? It's because of the years and years of electoral mismanagement.
That's
A big
interesting,
issue.
yeah.
A big issue, not common, one I didn't see, but one I saw on some of the little Facebook feeds, voters taking pictures of their ballots
Oh, as they're putting it.
as basically who they voted for. And immediately one voter in one of these precincts was actually pushed aside or told to come by the chairperson, and police immediately intervened. The reason for that is they're assuming some type of bribery
Vote
thing because
buying, right.
vote buying, because you're taking a picture of who you're about to put into the envelope, which in the US, by the way, is also illegal.
Oh, sure. Okay.
And so let me go real quick on the bad. I cannot stress enough education on how people need to vote. In an ideal world, we would put a television in front of every precinct as they're about to vote, where it shows what people are supposed to be
Well,
doing.
why don't they just simplify the voting process and make it electronic as opposed to
So
this?
there's a reason
And they
for
have
the
Madyans. What do you call a
complexity?
Madyan? Where everything is done by hand and with a
So
ruler.
there's a
It's
reason for the
ridiculous.
complexity because of past.
I get it, but I mean,
but now, right after we're moving on, so
The
the
third
system,
election.
the system does have to catch
So-
up with citizen demand.
I asked chairperson, why don't we do electronic ballots? Well, you have to understand in Armenia,
We don't trust them.
We don't trust the system. I said, excuse me. I said, you have electronic ballots on registration, but not on voting. I said, do you understand that when you scan the passport and the fingerprint, that's electronic.
Sure.
If I want to hack into it, I can hack into the system, bring all my friends, let's say cousins from Moldova, they're not citizens, for example, and just have them vote, and the system would accept them. I said, if you're basing it off of integrity, you're using part of this process, a system that's already electronic.
Right.
And so making it electronic would be just immensely make things a lot easier.
And we won't have to stay up till like 7, 8
oh
a.m.
my
to get
God.
results.
I mean, we have not slept last night, just for the record. Anyway.
And again, so this is the second election where they've used a little multiple ballots, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this is very common amongst the elderly. They'll come, they don't know what's going on with the ballots, with all these numbers. Which one do I put? It won't fit in there.
Yeah.
Can I scroll
If
up
they
and put
fold
If
it,
they
it
fold
becomes invalidated.
No,
Yeah.
no. So if they fold it, it depends. If it's torn and folded, it's invalidated. But if it's a slight fold, chairs will still consider it if it's a slight
right,
fold. But if it's what we actually had is interesting. We've had people put torn ballots into an envelope.
Well,
which
maybe
is
that's a sign of protest, yeah.
Which is weird. Like tear number, for example, 13, which I'll tell number 13 because number 13 was not there. So I'll just use that as an example.
Right.
They'll just tear a ballot and put that in it. The bad. Issues with address and registration. I think this is something that the Central Election Commission needs to fix sooner than later. You had voters showing up saying that, I'm on this registration, I'm on this address, but it's not coming up. A person said that my wife, who I've been married to 8 years, so she's not registered in the vote registration, but she's
But she
registered
is
in the
registered.
address.
And
so,
then you have to go and get it verified. It becomes, chaotic.
and then one final thing, party offices next to a precinct. And so in Armenia, I think it's 50 meters, but in the precinct where I finished, right in front of the precinct, and it's one of those small little roads that exists in Nordnork. It's about maybe a 7-10 foot road. Right across from it is an official party of Prosperous Armenia with nothing but Prosperous Armenia all over their windows is plaqued. And so I immediately, when I went in there first, I immediately went to chairperson. I said, listen, I know it's, beyond that mark, but it doesn't look good. Optically, it looks like that this polling place is sponsored by Prosperous Armenia. It just doesn't look good. Can we do anything about it? They said no, but I really do hope that the Central Election Commission, creates some distance between where party offices can set up their campaign or
Right, and where
district
precincts
headquarters.
prior
are.
to the
Yeah,
fact.
sure.
Yeah.
And then finally,
The
the
ugly?
ugly. Oh, the ugly. You know where I'm starting with this. So we basically stopped the vote. We took a picture of this lady. I have
Stop the
video.
count.
We stopped we stopped the vote process when this lady walked in with
Oh, with the
map.
pin. Okay, we're back to the pin.
We stopped the process. I recorded that lady. If you doesn't know that, I sent it over to our attorneys. She committed a violation. The prime minister did the same violation on camera and was allowed to vote. I understand this is minor, but not one person said, excuse me,
Yeah,
you
take it
have
out.
no right to come here, either leave or we're going to record a violation to you.
Yeah.
In fact, they were all with cameras around him, recorded him, as they would. And not one person got up and said, and I'm sure there were observers there. They said, excuse me, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Either leave or they said,
Take it off.
Take it off or record
Were
a
there
violation.
other voters there, or
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
just basically
They didn't clear it
secluded
out.
for him? Yeah, I was
No.
very curious how that
But
process
even still, it's a
went.
precinct. I mean,
Yeah.
he didn't even.
And it's on camera.
No, rules
I
are
mean,
rules, obviously.
And so rules are rules, and that was just the bad because again, if,
He should have known better.
If we-
Obviously.
if we stop the process, if our attorneys are like, record this person, give it to us, and the attorney called me 5 times as I was trying to manage this entire, I need this video now. It's that serious. They shouldn't be doing this. They told me, go to the chair, have the chair tell everybody we cannot repeat this ever again.
Right. And
This
was
was
it
one-
repeated?
No, this was one of the most
So,
serious
Rafayel, let me
ones.
ask you a question. So, it seems like the system is designed and makes it conducive to innocent errors from citizens.
correct.
Right? There's a lot of innocent
Absolutely,
errors.
absolutely.
We call that violations. It sounds like very
no.
egregious in the West, but
No.
a lot of just seem like innocent errors by citizens who are just, they're trying to make sense of things.
I would just say it's just interesting that the prime minister's team do not know the rules
course
for
they know
which
the
they're
rules,
running for an
yeah.
election.
But of course they
That's,
know the
you know.
rules.
So again, by the way, as going back before, these are voter-induced violations, right? These are not violations that are at the systemic level or at the commission level. These are voter-induced violations. And how do you fix this? Education.
Right.
Simple education. In an ideal world, every precinct would have a little TV that would rerun a video of how you properly vote. That's it.
And one other thing, the commission.
Oh, the commission, yes.
Well, I mean, you talked about it so much this morning.
So
Let's talk about it on air.
let's go ahead and clear the air on that. So what happens is, and I'll just briefly explain the process. At 8 o'clock, the vote is closed, the precinct is closed, the police close the precinct, they stand out their guard. And so there's several procedures they have to follow. They have to start writing some paperwork. They have to print out the total number of voters from that electronic form, the long little receipt. And after maybe 5 or 6 steps are done, they begin counting. And so the way the count happens is they merge all these desks, people sit down, all these all these commission workers that are supposed to be nonpartisan, but throughout the process, we're just, very emotionally charged. And so they basically, the chair is the only one that can pull from the ballot, and the chair is the only one that can open one by one. And basically, a couple of these members are assigned several parties, and they just collect this and start counting.
But the parties also have their proxies there.
The parties also have their proxies. Interestingly enough, the party proxies also participate in this count, but observers can, independent observers. So that's something that we should also consider. Why is it that party proxies are sitting there participating in ballot
That's
counts?
how it is. I mean,
So what are saying? Why can't observers participate? No,
Correct.
well, because you're an observer.
But party proxies
is
are
not a
not
state
neutral.
official.
No, but they're also
neutral.
there to protect their
They
party's
shouldn't be
vote.
touching it.
They should be
Yeah,
touching
but that's how it
ballots.
is. If you're,
And therein lies
prosperous,
the problem. It creates a conflict of interest between an official.
So this is a regulatory. This is
Yeah, it's not a it's sort of
not a
right.
violation. It's just how it's set
not
up.
because rules are allowed. The
Yeah.
rules need to be changed to make it more formal
Got
and
it.
basically thing. Right.
Okay.
And so what happened
Rigorous.
is the counting began, and the count, and then naturally you'll start with the people that voted last because they're at the top of the ballot box. 60-70% of it was coming from Armenia. And then as we went on, civil contract started building up its lead to a point where it was roughly half or a little bit more than half, with 60% of the ballots counted. And the one thing that was unfortunate, again, as an American, as somebody that does not live in this country and is very, I would say, indifferent about this political process, specifically with party preference, it was very painful to see how almost every single one of these commission members was verbally talking about their own opinion.
Because
Specifically their disdain for Pashinyan, I would say.
It's categorically unprofessional.
course.
And
Of
so
course, but-
I saw
Either party.
I saw the Pashinyan proxy, and he was just there quiet, like, biting his tongue, because if he said anything, I'm sure they would all jump him. But, to a point where you have the president, they call it the president, the Nahaga, or the commission chair, looking at me saying, what's going to happen to us? Because I already told them that, I do voting behavior. And I'm like,
Right.
why are you asking me? Just continue counting, right? And so it got to a point where, again, this was it became very partisan. I would say about half of the commission members at that time started just disclosing their opinion. Oh, this and this and this. And then one member of the commission, again, this is something, and as you will find out shortly, that was recorded, that a couple of people attest to. So I'm telling you something that there's definitely at least a dozen people that were there in that room. And so one of the commission members was just very upset, turned out to be he was for Armenia Alliance, looked at everybody and said, listen, if Nikol wins and if the migration starts, I see all of you, I will find all of you and I will kill you. He paused, he said, I'm serious about this. I said, I will find all of you, all you people that voted for Nikol, and I will kill you, he said. I'm not losing this country. Everybody got silent. The chair stopped counting the votes. I immediately went next to him, sort of, at that time I built a rapport with him. He was the one that was receiving the votes and putting it in the ballot throughout the day. So I was standing next to him throughout the process to make sure there's, proper lines and people, there's no any major violations. And so I went to him, kindly and said, hey, I know the camera up there has no audio, but there's a camera in front of you right now that's recording this entire count.
there was a camera? Or?
There was somebody put a phone camera, one of the
okay.
observers, next to a water bottle right in the middle of a table. And he didn't notice that. And he was like, is this your camera? I said, that is not my camera, but look, it's a camera, it's recording. And there's another person that just recorded you making threats against members of this commission, of this body. And so he took a step back and he said, well, whose camera is this? Immediately got defensive, and then one person said, "It's my camera." And this person answered, "Well, we're going to see about your words about this," basically saying like, "Hey, I'm going to file a complaint." And so, interestingly enough, that individual, the person that made the threat, asked him to come outside. They went outside for a talk.
Hashim Makren,
And then the guy came with his hand wrapped around him. I'm sure he convinced him, "Hey, don't do this."
Right.
And so we simply then the count moved on. This is why I finished like at 12 or 1 a.m. because of stuff like this. But it was just, again, I didn't take it too seriously, but it is beyond unprofessional and sad when you have a member of a commission in a closed room when the vote is counted engage in such type of behavior. Again, what we do in our own homes is what we do in our homes. But to be an official body member and to make that type of rhetoric, I immediately imagine what would happen if this happened in the U.S. Again, this was a very overt threat. It was done twice. And I even watched the couple of our independent observers, and the ladies had just the look of just stunning in their face. And so as we then walked home, I sort of gauged with them. I said, "Hey, so what's up with that little remark, right?" And so they were also shocked. They said, looks like it's going to be a complaint that's going to be filed, or one that was filed against him. But this is, one would imagine, at minimum, it's going to be criminal to engage in such threats.
You should have told them that, Armenians we're sore losers, especially Armenian men. We don't like losing, so we don't know how to handle it. Got emotional, said stupid things.
Look, I think it's also a reflection of how emotionally charged the environment is. We're not living in easy times. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of, partisanship in this case. But I'm not surprised because, as I said, these are things that we've seen so much of in the past. But
it just left left a very sour taste in my mouth.
The level of unprofessionalism.
The level of unprofessionalism.
Chairperson.
And this is 2026, right? This is not 2018. Doing this since 2018, I would understand. This is the first attempt. We've gone through this before. We're making definitely progress. And for you to engage in such rhetoric in your official position is unbecoming of the position. So
that was the good, the bad, and the ugly about Election Day. I do want to slowly wrap up. And I'm going to start with you, Nerses. What is the trajectory that we see moving forward? Look, for me, this was a very positive step forward for Armenian democracy. We have the results that we have right now, and we hope that both the incumbent and the opposition work to start healing the country. I mean, I know this sounds very lofty and all of that, but instead of, what we've seen in the past in Parliament, pointing fingers and yelling at each other, we actually start talking about policy. This is good that Pashinyan doesn't have a supermajority, that now maybe, they have to be more careful in how they frame things, because, his speech last night was...
aggressive?
You think?
Yeah, it comes with the territory.
It was very aggressive. But I don't want to dwell on that. I mean, we can if you want, but
the trajectory. Yeah. So a few things I'm paying attention to. One, whether we're gonna have an opposition that engages in the policies and discourse, as opposed to what we've had since 2021, that was purely obstructionist, whose objective was to collapse a democratically elected system.
Well, because they didn't have much wiggle room.
Whatever the case might be, right? Yeah. So would we see a constructive opposition that presents policies, that we have policy engagement, and they basically try to call out the government from their lens on policy issues, as opposed to extreme rhetoric and things that don't really make sense. So that's what I'm looking at. Because if our democratic culture isn't going to evolve, if our parliamentarians, right, if our opposition isn't going to evolve, then you're going to keep staying in the mud and slinging things as is. So that's the first thing. The second, I'm very curious what the local municipal elections look like at the end of this year. And then we have the year one elections in 28. So we've seen, for example, Armenian Alliance doesn't perform well at municipal elections, right? While Civic Contract has a mixed record, but generally performs well. Are we seeing the formation of national parties, or sort of these ad hoc groupings that participate in elections and then disappear? Right. So is Strong Armenia going towards that trajectory? Will they be performing well in the 26 end of this year's municipal elections?
Are they going to participate?
Right. And so those are all the indicators that we're looking at. The third factor, and Rafayel has been speaking about this for some time, is come 2031, with the cost of ruling, with the notion that after so many years, the new generation of voters no longer view you as a political leader, as a head of a party, as a revolutionary or
This is the
reformer,
status quo.
right? But a status quo. Would that produce, or what results that produces? So aside from expecting certain demeanor and behavior from the opposition, the bigger question is, by 2031, are we going to see, right, new blood coming into the potential leadership of civil contract? Also, are we going to see the formation of organic democratic parties?
Right.
Because Armenia does not have organic democratic parties. We spoke about, this party. We spoke about Armenian Sarkeesian's, for example, Republic Party. We've spoken about Rally for the Republic, sort of a lot of the liberal, heavily
right.
pro-European. But
Did not.
are they political parties, or right before elections they use whatever reputation, imaging they have to engage in politics? So these are very, very different things. So in that context, we have the opposition field pretty much absorbed by parties who generally do not have strong democratic leanings. But they're elected democratically, so that is the will of their electorate. So are we going to see civil contract by 2031 producing new leadership, or is it going to be a continuity of the status quo?
Yeah.
That's going to be an important indicator. And the second thing I'll be paying attention to is, are we going to be able to produce and reproduce organic democratic parties, or are we going to be facing the same thing in 2031 that we saw in 21 and this year as well?
Right. But a lot also depends on what happens in the country, what happens in the region, how people view these parties. Rafayel, what about you? You're somewhat disappointed by your experience
I'm
yesterday.
disappointed by the experience. I'm also, we talked about this, I'm disappointed by just the overall election campaign season, the rhetoric throughout the season. I'm also disappointed by civil contract. I think they've engaged, and this is my opinion, in some type of backsliding on democratic norms based on their behavior. Petty stuff, such as changing laws so that you can't have a name in a party. We talked about that. Petty stuff, such as having people who it is their right to vote in this country, doesn't matter where they're located, being greeted with military things. These are petty stuff. Again, you want to change the law long term. Don't change things right at that minute in order to respond to another party trying to, I don't want to say manipulate, influence some type of votes by legally trying to get people from a different country who are citizens of this country to come and vote. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, do things democratically, do things with the optics in mind. I ask a lot of times.
And with foresight. I mean, understand that these things might happen and prepare for them.
Because you don't know what's going to happen in the future and how the opposition is going to react. And so my one interest is how will they rule this time around, and always compare it to, will they understand that the next election cycle, they may not necessarily get majority, and are they going to engage in democratic backsliding, knowing that this is coming? Very, very similar to our good neighbors of the United National Movement in Georgia that engaged in. Again, I'm not saying 1-to-1, right? Because the democratic backsliding back then was just insurmountable. That amounted to police torture or torture by the police. But here, I just hope that civil contract goes back to their MOs of being these individuals that promote Western liberal democratic values, and not simply do a tit for tat between the opposition. And regarding the opposition, again, the opposition has to be more than just rhetoric that is, is unbecoming of the platform in our current political climate, because it's creating a lot of civil unrest and it's moralizing issues. Maria, when you call somebody a Davachan, when you call somebody a Turk, when you call someone a traitor, when you use these words, these are more words that you cannot irreconcile. There's no
zero
agreement.
sum.
There's no agreement between who if I call them a Davachan. We can't find a middle ground, because now I just nullified this individual as a member of our community here. And so the rhetoric needs to come down, and we need to go back to policy-based initiatives as opposed to throwing mud at each other.
Right. Well, on that note, healthy political debate, a healthy move toward consolidating democracy, more organic political parties, and hopefully these are good signs, growing pains. But thank you so much for taking the time to explain what we had yesterday on Election Day. And thank you for joining us.